For most of the history of life on Earth, nothing could see, not dimly, not poorly, not at all. For hundreds of millions of years, longer than dinosaurs existed, longer than mammals, longer than almost anything we think of as ancient, oceans full of living creatures moved, fed, hunted, and reproduced in total visual darkness. No shapes, no distance, no concept of what was approaching. And here is what makes it genuinely unsettling. Life didn't need it. Ecosystems were stable. Populations spread across entire seafloors. Creatures found food, avoided threats, and multiplied, all through pressure, chemistry, and contact. The rules of survival had already been fully written without a single eye to read them. But how did an entire world of complex creatures thrive for so long in total blindness? What creatures ruled this strange world? In this journey, we're going back to that forgotten ocean. Welcome to Snoozy Science. If you enjoy stories like this, I would really appreciate it if you hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. All right, let's step into the dark, mysterious oceans where strange creatures ruled long before eyes evolved. Before anything moved, before anything reached or pursued, existence settled into a quieter arrangement. Life unfolded as a condition rather than an action, a slow agreement between matter and its surroundings. There were no decisions being made, no directions being chosen, only a steady participation in what was already present. Energy drifted through this early world in gentle, constant ways. Sunlight filtered down through shallow waters, fading into softer gradients as it descended. Chemical reactions stirred at microscopic scales, exchanging particles, forming bonds, dissolving again. These were not events with intention, but processes that repeated again and again until repetition itself became stability. In this stillness, the ocean offered something essential. It held temperature within narrow limits, shielding delicate structures from sudden change. It carried dissolved minerals, traces of metals, and simple organic compounds, all suspended and circulating. Nothing needed to search for these elements. They arrived, slowly and continuously, brushing against surfaces, settling into folds, becoming part of whatever could receive them. The earliest forms of life did not chase energy, they absorbed it. Thin membranes allowed certain molecules to pass through, while keeping others out, creating small internal spaces where reactions could persist. Inside these boundaries, chemistry found a kind of rhythm. Molecules aligned, separated, and recombined in sequences that sustained themselves. There was no awareness of this process, only its continuation. Movement, as it would later be understood, had no role here. There were no muscles, no limbs, no coordinated shifts through water, yet change still occurred. Currents drifted across the sea floor, carrying particles from one place to another. Tiny variations in density caused slow sinking or rising. Even without effort, these simple forms found themselves in new conditions, exposed to slightly different mixtures of chemicals and light. Survival, in this context, was not a struggle, it was a persistence. As long as the surrounding environment remained within certain limits, these early systems continued to function. When conditions shifted beyond those limits, the processes simply stopped. There was no attempt to resist or escape. What endured did so because it fit, quietly and precisely, into the narrow possibilities allowed by its surroundings. Time stretched across immense spans, and within that duration, small variations appeared. Some membranes held together more reliably. Some internal reactions produced more stable outcomes. These differences were subtle, almost imperceptible, yet over countless cycles they accumulated. The ocean did not guide these changes, but it filtered them, allowing only certain arrangements to remain. Chemistry, energy, and environment formed a closed loop, each influencing the others without direction or purpose. The balance was delicate, yet it persisted for vast periods. Life existed as an extension of the ocean itself, inseparable from the conditions that allowed it to continue. There was no boundary between organism and world that carried meaning, only a gradient where one became the other. In this earliest chapter, existence required very little. No senses, no coordination, no awareness, only the ability to maintain a small pocket of order within a larger, ever-shifting system. And within that modest requirement, life found a way to endure, quietly occupying the spaces where possibility and stability briefly met. Shapes appeared before identity ever settled into them. Across the quiet surfaces of the ancient seafloor, forms emerged that did not resemble creatures in any familiar sense. They did not suggest faces or limbs, nor did they offer any hint of direction. Instead, they spread outward in patterns, as though life itself had chosen geometry as its first expression. Some lay flat against the sediment like soft imprints, their bodies divided into repeating segments that mirrored one another without leading anywhere. Others rose gently upward, branching into fronds that resembled delicate leaves, though no true leaves yet existed. There were forms that coiled in spirals, others that extended in radiating lines, each one following a design that seemed complete without needing a front or a back. These organisms carried no central point to guide them. There was no head to gather information, no leading edge to define movement. Every part of their structure existed with equal importance, responding locally to the conditions that touched it. If something brushed against one side, only that region changed. The rest remained undisturbed, continuing its quiet exchange with the surrounding water. In place of symmetry that suggests motion or intention, many of these bodies followed unfamiliar arrangements. Radial patterns spread evenly in all directions, like ripples frozen into living tissue. Other forms displayed a kind of glide symmetry, where segments repeated in a staggered sequence, creating a gentle offset rhythm across the body. These arrangements did not point forward or backward. They simply existed, balanced within themselves. Texture varied as much as shape. Some surfaces appeared smooth and continuous, while others were ridged or quilted, divided into soft compartments that expanded and contracted with subtle changes in pressure. These textures were not decorative. They shaped how water flowed across each body, how particles settled, and how chemical exchanges unfolded along their surfaces. There was no clear boundary between organism and environment in the way later life would define it. Many of these forms seemed to merge with the seafloor itself, anchored without roots, resting without tension. They absorbed what passed over them, releasing byproducts just as quietly, participating in cycles that required no coordination beyond their own structure. Among these strange presences were organisms that defy easy comparison, even now. Some resembled layered discs stacked upon one another, each layer slightly offset, creating a gentle spiral that rose only a small distance above the sediment. Others appeared as elongated ribbons, their surfaces marked by repeating units that gave them a faintly patterned appearance, as if woven rather than grown. Without a front to lead or a rear to follow, these creatures did not move with purpose. When movement occurred, it was subtle and diffuse, a slow shifting of position influenced by currents or gradual changes in the surrounding environment. Their forms did not chase or avoid. They persisted in place, shaped by the conditions that surrounded them. In this early chapter of life, form did not serve behavior. It defined existence itself. Each organism was less an individual moving through the world and more a configuration through which the world passed. The absence of recognizable anatomy did not limit them, it allowed a wider range of possibilities, many of which would never appear again. What remains in the fossil record offers only quiet impressions of these beings, outlines pressed into stone, preserving shapes that once lived without direction or awareness. They appear now as patterns left behind, traces of a time when life explored forms unconstrained by the structures that would later define it. Rising from the seafloor, like a quiet extension of it, a slender stalk lifted a small body into the surrounding water. It did not sway with intention, nor did it reach or withdraw. It simply held its place, elevating a delicate structure above the sediment, where currents passed more freely. At the top of this narrow column rested a circular crown, arranged with careful symmetry. Fine, petal-like elements curved outward, forming a ring that opened into the water. They resembled the gentle spread of a flower in bloom, yet there was no sunlight being gathered, no internal process resembling photosynthesis. This was not a plant, though it borrowed a familiar shape. It was something quieter, an organism shaped to receive rather than to seek. As water moved across this crown, tiny particles drifted inward. Nutrient fragments, microscopic organic matter, and suspended debris were guided toward the center, where a simple opening allowed them to be taken in. There was no decision behind this act, no awareness of what arrived. The structure itself performed the work, directing flow, concentrating what passed nearby, and allowing chemistry to continue within. The stalk below remained still, anchored securely to the surface beneath it. It provided stability rather than motion, holding the organism in a position where feeding could occur without interruption. This connection to the seafloor was not restrictive, it was essential. By remaining fixed, the organism allowed the environment to move around it, bringing a continuous supply of material without the need for effort. Within this form, there was no head to guide behavior, no centralized organ to process information. Each part contributed to a single, ongoing function. The crown gathered, the opening received, and internal reactions transformed what was taken in. These processes unfolded without variation, repeating as long as conditions allowed. Its appearance suggested a boundary that had not yet been drawn. The distinction between plant and animal, so clear in later life, did not exist here in the same way. This organism did not fit neatly into either category. It neither produced its own energy through light nor pursued food through movement. Instead, it occupied a space between, shaped by the conditions of its time rather than by definitions that would come much later. Around it, similar forms likely rose in quiet clusters, each one anchored, each one opening gently into the passing water. Together, they created a landscape that seemed still at a distance, yet was continuously engaged in subtle exchanges. Particles flowed, surfaces interacted, and life persisted through these small, steady interactions. The circular structure at the top was more than a simple arrangement. Its symmetry allowed it to function equally from all directions, receiving whatever the currents delivered. There was no need to orient itself, no advantage in turning toward one side or another. Every direction held the same possibility, and the organism was prepared for all of them at once. In this form, complexity did not arise from movement or perception, but from structure itself. Shape determined function, and function required no guidance beyond what the structure already provided. It existed as a quiet participant in its environment, neither separate from it nor fully merged, but balanced within it. Over time, this kind of life would give way to forms that moved, that sensed, that distinguished between directions. Yet here, in this earlier moment, a simple stalk and a circular crown were enough. They allowed life to rise slightly above the surface, to meet the passing world, and to continue without ever needing to know that it was doing so. There was no leading edge to these lives, no single side that faced the world first. Orientation had not yet taken hold as a defining feature. Bodies existed without a forward or backward, without a sense of alignment that would later guide motion. Each surface met the surrounding water in the same quiet way, equal in function, equal in exposure. In the absence of direction, movement unfolded differently. It did not begin with intent or follow a path toward a destination. Instead, it emerged from the gentle forces already present, subtle shifts in currents, slight differences in density, the slow settling and lifting of forms within the water. Creatures turned not because they chose to, but because the environment nudged them into new positions. Rotation replaced progression. Some bodies spun gradually, their shapes allowing water to pass unevenly across their surfaces, creating a soft, continuous turning. Others drifted in short, irregular paths, pausing as the surrounding conditions changed, then shifting again without any pattern that could be called purposeful. These motions were not guided. They were the result of interaction, of form meeting flow. Without a front to receive information first, responses occurred wherever contact happened. A change in chemistry on one side of the body did not signal a turn toward or away. It simply altered that region, while the rest remained as it was. If the organism shifted afterward, it did so because the balance of forces had changed, not because it recognized a difference. This way of existing did not require coordination across the entire body. There was no need to unify movement or align parts toward a shared goal. Each region functioned within its own small context, contributing to the whole without directing it. The organism, as a complete form, did not navigate. It was carried, adjusted, and reshaped moment by moment. Over time, these subtle movements allowed life to spread, not through pursuit, but through gradual displacement. A body that drifted slightly from its original position might settle elsewhere, encountering new conditions that supported its continuation. In this way, distribution occurred without intention, guided only by the quiet mechanics of water and form. Even when anchored or resting against the seafloor, direction remained absent. Contact with the surface did not create an upper or lower side in the sense that later life would experience. It simply established a boundary, one region in touch with solid ground, another exposed to open water. There was no hierarchy between these regions, only difference. The absence of direction also meant the absence of preference. There was no advantage in facing one way or another, no benefit in aligning with a particular flow. Every orientation offered the same opportunity to interact with the surrounding environment. This equality allowed forms to remain simple, free from the need to develop specialized regions for leading or following. In this early world, movement was a quiet consequence rather than an active pursuit. Bodies drifted, rotated, and shifted as part of a continuous exchange with their surroundings. There was no sense of arrival or departure, only a steady participation in the gentle motions of the ocean. As time moved forward, some forms would begin to favor certain orientations, subtle asymmetries emerging that hinted at a future where direction would matter. Yet here, in this moment, life existed without that constraint. It occupied space without aiming through it, changing position without ever moving toward anything at all. Nothing hurried in this world. The pace of existence settled into a steady rhythm, unbroken by pursuit or sudden flight. Life unfolded without interruption, each form continuing its quiet processes without the need to anticipate or evade. Across these early communities, no organism specialized in hunting another. There were no bodies shaped for speed, No structures designed to grasp, pierce, or tear. The idea of one life actively seeking another had not yet taken hold. Instead, energy moved through the system in softer ways, passed along through contact, absorption, and gradual transformation. Without predators, survival did not depend on awareness. There was no advantage in sensing something from a distance or reacting before it arrived. Change occurred only at the moment of contact, and even then, the response remained simple. If a condition supported continuation, processes carried on. If it did not, they slowed or ceased. There was no struggle against it, only a quiet acceptance built into the nature of these forms. Bodies reflected this calm arrangement. They did not require reinforcement against attack or structures for rapid movement. Surfaces remained soft, open to exchange, shaped primarily by how they interacted with their surroundings rather than by any need for defense. Form followed stability, not conflict. In this absence of predation, space was shared without urgency. Organisms spread across the seafloor or drifted nearby, existing alongside one another without direct competition for survival through force. Their interactions were indirect, mediated by the environment they all occupied. Nutrients passed from one to another through cycles that unfolded slowly, without disruption. Time moved differently here. Without the pressure of pursuit, there was no need for quick decisions or rapid change. Processes could extend, repeat, and settle into patterns that lasted across immense spans. Life did not rush to complete its functions. It persisted through consistency, through the quiet repetition of chemical exchanges that sustained it. Even growth followed this gentle pace. Structures expanded gradually, shaped by the steady availability of resources rather than by any urgency to outpace a threat. There was no advantage in becoming faster or more reactive. Stability itself was the advantage, allowing forms to endure as long as conditions remained within their narrow range. This world was not empty of interaction, but its interactions lacked intensity. Organisms influenced one another through subtle shifts in their shared environment. The presence of one form could alter the flow of nutrients or the distribution of particles, creating small variations that others would encounter. These effects were diffuse, spreading outward without focus, shaping the system as a whole rather than targeting any individual. In such a setting, life did not divide into roles of hunter and hunted. It existed along a continuum, each form participating in processes that connected them without direct confrontation. The boundaries between them remained soft, defined more by structure than by behavior. Over long stretches of time, this calm equilibrium held. It allowed life to explore forms and functions without the pressure of conflict, to settle into patterns that required little beyond their own continuation. The absence of predators did not limit life. It defined a different kind of balance, one where survival emerged from harmony with the environment, rather than from the ability to outpace or outmaneuver another living form. A faint disturbance passed across a soft body, and something shifted. Not everywhere at once, not with coordination, but in the precise region where contact occurred. The change was immediate and local, a quiet adjustment shaped entirely by what had touched it. There was no awareness behind this response, no sense of cause or consequence. The body did not register an event as something to interpret. Instead, its structure translated external changes directly into action. A variation in pressure altered the tension of its surface. A trace of dissolved molecules triggered internal reactions that followed fixed pathways. These processes unfolded automatically, embedded within the fabric of the organism itself. Touch carried its own kind of signal. When another surface brushed against these early forms, cells along the point of contact responded by tightening, bending, or subtly withdrawing. This was not a movement chosen to avoid or to engage. It was a direct continuation of the physical interaction, as predictable as the way a current bends around an obstacle. Chemistry offered another quiet language. Invisible gradients of substances drifted through the water, unevenly distributed across space. When these molecules encountered the outer layers of a body, they bound to receptive structures, setting off sequences of reactions within. These sequences did not lead to thought or interpretation. They led only to change, altering internal conditions in ways that might encourage continued activity or bring it to a pause. Water itself carried information through motion. Slight shifts in flow pressed differently across each surface, creating variations that the organism could not perceive, yet still responded to. Regions exposed to stronger movement might contract or expand, while calmer areas remained unchanged. The body, in this way, became a map of its immediate surroundings, shaped continuously by forces it could not recognize. These responses did not combine into a unified behavior. There was no central process gathering signals and deciding on a course of action. Each part of the organism acted within its own limited context, following the rules embedded in its structure. The result was a kind of fragmented activity, where changes occurred in patches rather than across the whole. Even so, these simple reactions allowed life to persist within shifting conditions. A slight contraction might reduce exposure to an unfavorable chemical. A subtle expansion could increase contact with a beneficial one. These outcomes were not intended, yet they supported continuation. The organism did not know what it was doing, but its design allowed certain interactions to favor stability. Across these early communities, countless such responses unfolded simultaneously. Each organism engaged with its surroundings in this direct, unmediated way, translating contact into change without pause or reflection. The seafloor became a quiet field of interaction, where bodies adjusted continuously, shaped by forces that moved through them. There was no memory of these moments, no accumulation of experience. Each response stood alone, complete in itself, without reference to what had come before. Time did not build into awareness. It simply passed, carrying with it an endless sequence of interactions that began and ended without being known. In this world, behavior existed without intention. Action arose from structure, from the way matter had arranged itself into forms capable of responding. These forms did not interpret their surroundings. They became part of them, shifting in place as touch, chemistry, and movement passed quietly across their surfaces. Geometry settled into living matter long before anatomy found its familiar outlines. Across the quiet seafloor, forms arranged themselves in patterns that seemed complete without suggesting any direction or hierarchy. These were not bodies built around a central path from front to back, but structures organized in ways that spread outward, evenly, or in repeating sequences that did not lead anywhere at all. Radial symmetry appeared as one of the earliest expressions of this order. A central point anchored the body, while identical sections extended around it, each one mirroring the next. There was no preferred side, no region that held more importance than another. Every angle offered the same arrangement, allowing the organism to exist without orientation. The structure did not guide movement or perception. It simply maintained balance, distributing form equally in all directions. Other bodies unfolded in shapes that resembled discs, pressed gently against the surface beneath them. These discs carried subtle divisions, faint lines that traced across their surfaces in patterns that repeated with quiet consistency. Some were smooth and uninterrupted, while others showed layered textures as though built from thin sheets stacked upon one another. Their edges did not define a boundary in the way later organisms would. They blended softly into their surroundings, forming a continuous presence rather than a distinct outline. Frond-like structures rose from the seafloor in delicate arrangements, branching into smaller and smaller segments. Each division followed a predictable pattern, repeating at different scales, creating a form that seemed both simple and intricate at once. These branches did not serve as limbs or appendages. They expanded the surface of the organism, increasing its contact with the surrounding water, allowing more interaction to occur across its entire form. Tube-shaped bodies introduced another variation, extending as elongated structures that maintained a consistent diameter along their length. Some curved gently, while others remained straight, anchored at one end or resting along the sediment. Their interiors provided pathways for chemical exchange, spaces where internal processes could continue without interruption. These tubes did not channel movement or direct flow in a purposeful way. They existed as stable conduits, shaped by the requirements of their own structure. Across all these forms, there was an absence that would later become essential. No heads emerged to gather information, no limbs extended to interact with specific points, no segmentation that suggested coordinated motion. The body was not divided into specialized regions with distinct roles. Instead, it functioned as a whole, with each part contributing equally to its continuation. This unfamiliar geometry allowed life to explore possibilities that would not persist into later eras. Without the constraints of direction or specialization, forms could remain simple in some ways while achieving complexity through repetition and pattern. The result was a landscape of organisms that appeared more like living designs than creatures, their shapes defined by balance and distribution rather than by action. Over time, some of these patterns would give way to new arrangements, where asymmetry and specialization began to emerge. Yet, within this earlier moment, geometry itself was enough. It provided a framework for existence, a way for life to occupy space and interact with its surroundings without needing the structures that would later define animal bodies. What remains of these organisms today are impressions of their forms, preserved as outlines and textures that hint at the patterns they once embodied. They stand as quiet records of a time when life shaped itself according to principles that feel distant, yet remain written into the deep history of living matter. Long before familiar categories took shape, entire communities existed that resist easy placement within the tree of life. Their forms, preserved only in faint impressions, suggest organisms that followed rules no longer visible in the living world. They occupied vast stretches of the seafloor, arranged in quiet assemblies that do not resemble any modern ecosystem in structure or composition. These beings belonged to what is now called the Ediacaran biota, a collection of organisms whose identities remain uncertain. Their bodies lacked hard parts, composed instead of soft tissues that pressed gently into sediment, leaving behind outlines rather than structures. What remains is not the organism itself, but a trace of its presence, a negative space where something once rested. Among these forms were broad, leaf-like shapes that extended outward in repeating branches, each segment mirroring the next with precise regularity. Others appeared as oval impressions marked by ribbed patterns, their surfaces divided into units that suggested organization without revealing function. There were circular discs, elongated forms, and structures that seem to blend multiple patterns into a single body, resisting comparison to any known group. Because of their softness, much of their biology remains hidden. Without preserved internal features, there is little to indicate how they processed energy, how they reproduced, or how they interacted with their surroundings beyond what their shapes imply. The fossil record offers silhouettes, not systems, leaving their inner workings largely beyond reach. Some scientists have proposed that these organisms represent early animals, ancestors to later forms that would develop more recognizable features. Others suggest they belong to entirely separate lineages, experiments in multicellular life that did not persist. There are even ideas that certain forms might not fit within the animal kingdom at all, instead representing a distinct category of life that has no modern equivalent. This uncertainty arises not from a lack of study, but from the nature of the evidence itself. The impressions left behind capture only a single moment, a final contact between body and sediment. They do not reveal movement, behavior, or change over time. Each fossil stands as a quiet fragment, offering shape without context. Within these ancient communities, diversity was already present. Different forms coexisted across the same surfaces, arranged in patterns that suggest a shared environment rather than isolated occurrences. Yet the relationships between them remain unclear. There is little evidence of direct interaction, no clear signs of one organism affecting another in a way that can be confidently traced. The absence of recognizable anatomy makes classification difficult. Features that would later define major groups, such as mouths, limbs, or internal organs, are either missing or not preserved. Without these markers, placing these organisms within existing categories becomes an exercise in interpretation rather than certainty. Even so, their presence marks an important chapter in the history of life. They demonstrate that complexity had already begun to emerge, that multicellular forms were exploring a wide range of possibilities. These possibilities did not all lead forward. Some ended quietly, leaving behind only the impressions we now study. As the seafloor recorded these shapes, it preserved a world that feels distant, not only in time, but in structure. The Ediacaran organisms remain as traces of an experiment in life that unfolded without clear descendants, a collection of forms that once thrived, yet do not fully connect to what came after. Most of what once lived has vanished without leaving a trace. The record that remains is not a complete account, but a narrow window shaped by rare conditions and quiet chance. Beneath layers of stone, only certain moments were preserved, while countless others passed without imprint, dissolving back into the processes that formed them. Soft bodies, which defined so much of early life, offered little resistance to time. Without rigid structures to anchor their shapes, they settled into sediment only briefly before breaking down. Microbes, chemistry, and pressure worked together to erase them, returning their materials to the surrounding environment. What had once been a living form became indistinguishable from everything around it. For preservation to occur, circumstances had to align with unusual precision. A body needed to rest upon fine sediment, undisturbed long enough for its outline to press into the surface. Layers of material had to accumulate gently above it, sealing that impression before decay could fully erase it. Even then, what remained was not the organism itself, but a faint echo of its shape, a shallow impression that hinted at what once occupied that space. Because these conditions were uncommon, the vast majority of early organisms disappeared entirely from the record. Their existence can only be inferred through indirect signs, subtle chemical traces, or patterns in the rocks that suggest biological activity. These hints offer glimpses, but they do not reveal form in the way a preserved impression can. They speak of presence without describing appearance. The fragments that do survive create an incomplete picture. Certain environments favored preservation more than others, leading to clusters of fossils that represent only specific conditions rather than the full range of life that existed. Entire ecosystems may have thrived in places where no trace could be recorded, leaving gaps that cannot be filled with certainty. This uneven record shapes understanding in quiet ways. What is known is drawn from what happened to be preserved, not from everything that once lived. Forms that appear common in the fossil record may have been rare in their time, while others that left no trace could have been widespread. The absence of evidence does not indicate absence of life, only the limits of preservation. Even within preserved impressions, much remains hidden. Internal structures are rarely captured, leaving questions about how these organisms functioned. The outlines suggest shape, but not the full complexity of the processes that sustained them. Interpretation becomes an act of careful inference, guided by comparison and constrained by what little is visible. Across these layers of stone, the story of early life unfolds in fragments. Each fossil offers a moment, a single interaction between body and sediment, preserved by chance. Between these moments lies an immense silence, filled with forms and processes that can no longer be directly observed. This silence does not diminish the reality of what once existed. It reflects the nature of preservation itself, selective and incomplete. Life persisted across vast spans of time, shaping and reshaping the environment, leaving behind only occasional impressions as evidence. What remains today is a collection of traces, scattered across the geological record, each one a small piece of a much larger story. The full extent of early life cannot be reconstructed in detail, but its presence is felt in these quiet remnants, in the patterns that suggest far more than they reveal. Motion continued, though nothing could perceive where it led. Across the ancient seafloor and the water just above it, bodies shifted in slow and subtle ways, carried along by forces that required no awareness to guide them. Movement existed, but it did not belong to the organism in the way it would later. It belonged to the environment, and life moved within it. Currents passed gently across these early forms, pressing against surfaces, sliding along contours, lifting edges, and settling them again. A slight variation in flow could tilt a body, causing it to lean or rotate. Over time, these small adjustments accumulated, changing position without any moment of decision. The path was not chosen. It was shaped continuously by what surrounded it. Some organisms released tiny fragments of themselves into the water, small pieces that drifted away and settled elsewhere. These fragments carried the same simple structures, allowing life to appear in new places without travel in the usual sense. Expansion occurred not through directed movement, but through quiet dispersal, guided entirely by the movement of water and the conditions it carried. Even among forms that remained intact, subtle internal changes could lead to slow shifts in position. A slight difference in density might cause a body to rise or sink just enough to encounter a new layer of water. Variations in temperature or chemistry could alter how materials were exchanged across its surface, influencing how it settled or lifted over time. These changes did not aim toward anything. They followed gradients that existed independently of the organism. There was no tracking of resources, no adjustment based on distant signals. Movement responded only to what was immediate, what touched or surrounded the body in that moment. If conditions changed gradually across space, the organism might shift along that gradient, but not because it recognized a direction. The shift occurred because each local interaction favored a slightly different state, and over time, those differences guided the overall position. Surfaces played a quiet role in shaping this movement. The texture and form of a body influenced how water flowed around it, creating areas of pressure that encouraged slight rotations or drifts. A smoother surface might allow water to pass evenly, resulting in minimal change, while a more complex structure could catch the flow unevenly, leading to gentle turning. These effects were not controlled. They emerged from the interaction between form and motion. Spread across large areas, these processes allowed life to occupy new spaces without any need for orientation or pursuit. A body that shifted only a small distance might, over long periods, find itself in a different region entirely. There was no awareness of departure or arrival, only a continuous presence within changing conditions. Even in this quiet movement, patterns began to emerge. Certain forms appeared more often in particular environments, not because they sought them out, but because their structures allowed them to persist under those conditions. Movement and survival became linked through these subtle interactions, shaping where life could continue. In this early world, motion was not a tool but a consequence. It did not serve a goal or respond to a plan. It unfolded as part of the same processes that sustained life, guided by forces that required no interpretation. Bodies shifted, rotated, and spread, carried by the quiet mechanics of their surroundings, moving without ever knowing that they moved. Signals moved through the water long before anything could see them. They arrived without shape or outline, carried as faint changes that brushed against living surfaces, and passed on. In this quiet exchange, the earliest senses began to take form, not as awareness, but as the ability to register difference. Touch remained the most immediate of these signals. When a body encountered another surface, even lightly, the contact altered its outer layers. Cells along that region changed their state, tightening, relaxing, or shifting their internal balance. This was not recognition. It was a direct translation where physical contact became a change within the structure itself. The organism did not know it had touched something, it simply responded. Alongside touch, chemistry offered a more diffuse form of sensing. Molecules dissolved in the surrounding water formed gradients, uneven distributions that extended across space. These gradients carried information about what was present nearby, traces of organic material, byproducts of other processes, subtle variations in composition. When these molecules met receptive sites on a body's surface, they bound briefly, initiating internal reactions that followed fixed patterns. Through these interactions, organisms could detect the presence of what sustained them. Food did not appear as an object or a target. It existed as a concentration, a slightly richer region within the surrounding water. Where this concentration increased, internal processes continued more easily. Where it diminished, they slowed. The organism did not move toward or away in any deliberate sense. It existed within these gradients, its activity shaped by their presence. Nearby surfaces also became part of this silent sensing. The boundary between open water and solid ground created subtle differences in flow and chemical distribution. Bodies in contact with these surfaces experienced changes along the regions that touched them, while exposed areas encountered different conditions. This contrast allowed the organism to exist in relation to its surroundings without needing to interpret that relationship. Water movement carried these signals from place to place, blending them, separating them, and presenting them in ever-shifting combinations. A slight change in flow could alter how molecules reached a surface, how pressure was distributed, how contact occurred. The organism responded continuously, adjusting its internal state in ways that reflected these changing conditions, even though it held no awareness of them. There was no integration of these signals into a unified perception. Each interaction remained local, confined to the region where it occurred. Yet together, they created a kind of distributed sensing where the entire body participated in receiving and responding. The organism became a surface of interaction, a place where the environment left its mark in countless small ways. These early senses did not replace vision in a direct sense, as vision had not yet emerged. Instead, they provided the foundation upon which later forms of perception would build. They allowed life to engage with its surroundings beyond simple presence, to respond to variations that were not defined by direct contact alone. In this stage, sensing remained inseparable from structure. The ability to detect and respond was not housed in specialized organs, but spread across the body itself. Every surface carried the potential to register change, to participate in the quiet exchange between organism and environment. Through touch and chemistry, life began to interact with signals that could not be seen, shaping its existence through responses that unfolded without awareness, yet still guided its continuation within an ever-changing world. Nothing was expected before it arrived. Change belonged only to the present moment, unfolding at the instant of contact and nowhere else. There was no space within these early forms for imagining what might come next, no structure capable of holding a future in advance. Fear, as it would later exist, depends on anticipation. It arises from the ability to detect something at a distance, to recognize a pattern, and to respond before direct interaction occurs. In this earlier world, such conditions had not yet formed. Without vision, without any mechanism to project events beyond immediate contact, there was no pathway for anticipation to emerge. Life continued in a state that remained entirely bound to the present. When a surface pressed against a body, a response followed. When chemical conditions shifted at a particular location, internal processes adjusted. These changes happened as direct consequences of interaction, not as attempts to avoid or prepare. There was no delay between event and response, but also no extension beyond it. This absence shaped behavior in subtle ways. Bodies did not withdraw from distant signals or alter their state in expectation of change. They remained open to their surroundings, responding only when contact occurred. The environment, in turn, unfolded without resistance from anything that might foresee its effects. Each interaction stood alone, complete in the moment it happened. Even as more complex responses began to appear, they remained confined to immediate stimuli. A slight contraction might follow a touch, a change in internal chemistry might alter the rate of ongoing processes, but these responses did not accumulate into something that could be carried forward. There was no memory shaping future reactions, no stored pattern that influenced what would happen next. Time passed through these organisms without being recorded. Each moment arrived and dissolved without leaving a trace that could alter what followed. In this way, life existed without continuity in experience, even as it persisted physically. The body endured, but its responses remained isolated, unconnected to one another. The absence of anticipation also meant the absence of avoidance. Nothing moved away before contact, nothing adjusted in advance of change. Interaction occurred fully, and only afterward did the organism shift, if its structure allowed for it. This sequence defined the rhythm of existence, contact followed by response, repeated without variation. Within this rhythm, there was a kind of quiet stability. Without the need to predict or prepare, processes remained simple, guided entirely by immediate conditions. The complexity that would later arise from anticipating the future had not yet taken shape. Life operated within a narrower frame, one that required no extension beyond the present moment. This world, though active in its own way, remained free of the patterns that would later define awareness of threat. There was no distinction between safe and unsafe before interaction occurred. Only after contact did differences become apparent, expressed through changes in structure or activity. As life continued to evolve, new forms would begin to extend beyond this immediate frame, gradually developing the ability to detect and respond to signals before contact. Yet here, in this earlier state, existence remained grounded in the present alone, where every change began at the moment it was felt, and nowhere before. A subtle shift began within certain bodies, not visible from the outside, yet altering how they responded to the world. Where once each region acted alone, small connections started to form between distant parts. Signals no longer remained confined to a single point of contact. They could travel, spreading across the body in faint, coordinated waves. These early networks did not resemble the structured systems that would come much later. There were no defined pathways leading to a central point, no organ gathering and interpreting information. Instead, thin strands of excitable cells linked neighboring regions, allowing changes in one place to influence another. A touch at one edge could now ripple outward, creating a broader response that involved more of the body at once. The effect of this connection was quiet but significant. Responses became slightly faster, not because anything anticipated the stimulus, but because signals could move more efficiently through these simple networks. What had once been isolated reactions began to merge into patterns, creating movements that appeared more unified, though still without direction or purpose. When a disturbance occurred, the change no longer remained local. It spread, passing from one region to the next, carried by shifts in electrical potential across connected cells. These signals did not carry meaning in the way later nervous systems would. They transmitted change itself, a brief alteration that moved along the network and faded as it traveled. This spreading allowed different parts of the body to act together. A contraction in one area could be followed by a similar change nearby, creating a sequence that moved across the organism. These sequences were not controlled or planned. They emerged from the structure of the network, shaped by how the connections were arranged and how signals flowed through them. Even with this increased coordination, there was no central control. No region directed the activity of the whole. No single point held authority over the rest. Each part remained dependent on its immediate connections, responding to signals as they arrived and passing them onward without interpretation. The organism functioned as a distributed system, its behavior arising from the interaction of many small parts. This arrangement allowed for new kinds of interaction with the environment. A gentle change in water movement or a variation in chemistry could now produce a response that extended beyond the initial point of contact. The body could adjust more broadly, shifting its state in a way that reflected the combined influence of multiple signals. Over time, these networks likely became more intricate, adding layers of connection that allowed signals to travel along different paths. Some routes may have carried signals more quickly, others more slowly, creating variations in how responses unfolded. Yet even as complexity increased, the fundamental nature of the system remained unchanged. There was still no awareness, no perception, only the movement of signals through connected cells. In this early stage, the nervous system existed not as a center of thought, but as a means of linking distant parts into a more cohesive whole. It allowed the organism to respond in ways that were slightly more integrated, shaping behavior through the flow of signals rather than through isolated reactions. These first networks marked a quiet turning point. They did not introduce intention or understanding, but they changed how life interacted with its surroundings, allowing responses to extend across the body in ways that had not been possible before. Soft bodies began to move with a rhythm that seemed almost deliberate, though nothing within them chose the motion. Transparent forms drifted through the water, their shapes expanding and contracting in slow, repeating cycles. Each pulse gathered the surrounding water, then released it, allowing the organism to glide gently forward before settling again into stillness. These were among the earliest creatures to carry a simple nerve net, a loose web of connected cells spread across the body. Signals traveled through this network in waves, not directed by any central point, but passing from one region to another in patterns shaped by the structure itself. When one part contracted, the signal moved outward, encouraging neighboring regions to follow, creating a coordinated motion that unfolded across the entire form. The result was a steady pulsing, a movement that repeated without variation. It did not aim toward anything or adjust based on distant conditions. It simply continued, driven by the internal flow of signals that moved through the network. Each contraction was followed by relaxation, each wave giving rise to the next, forming a continuous cycle that allowed the organism to drift through its surroundings. Within these bodies, there was no center of thought, no place where signals were gathered and interpreted. The nerve net did not create awareness. It allowed coordination, linking distant parts into a unified motion, but it did not give rise to perception or intention. The organism did not know that it moved. It did not recognize the water it passed through or the particles it encountered. Even so, these movements allowed a new kind of interaction with the environment. As the body pulsed, water flowed across its surfaces in changing patterns, bringing with it traces of nutrients and subtle variations in chemistry. Contact with these elements could alter the signals traveling through the nerve net, adjusting the rhythm slightly, though never in a way that suggested choice. The structure of these organisms remained simple, yet it supported a more fluid existence. No longer confined to slow drifting or passive displacement, they could move in gentle, repeated motions that carried them through different regions. This movement did not involve pursuit or escape. It was a continuous expression of the internal patterns that defined their behavior. Their forms often appeared delicate, with soft edges that merged into the surrounding water. Some carried trailing structures that extended behind them, increasing their contact with the environment. These extensions did not grasp or reach. They participated in the same quiet exchanges as the rest of the body, responding to touch and chemistry in the same distributed way. As these creatures pulsed through the water, their movements created subtle disturbances, small currents that influenced the space around them. These effects were not intentional. They emerged naturally from the interaction between body and fluid, shaping the environment in ways that could, in turn, influence other nearby forms. In this stage, life had begun to coordinate its responses across the whole body, yet it remained without thought or awareness. Signals moved, muscles contracted, and movement emerged, but there was no understanding behind it. The organism existed within its own rhythm, carried by patterns that repeated without reflection. Through these early nerve nets, life found a way to move more cohesively, to link its parts into a single, flowing motion. It did so without ever needing to know that it was moving, continuing to drift, pulse, and respond within a world that remained entirely beyond its awareness. Long before anything could form an image, light moved quietly through the water, shaping the world in ways that required no observer. It arrived from above as a steady presence, filtering downward and fading as it passed through layers of depth. Its influence was not seen, but it was felt in the conditions it created, in the subtle differences between one place and another. Near the surface, light carried energy that interacted with the simplest forms of life, supporting processes that depended on its presence. As it traveled deeper, that energy diminished, creating gradients that extended through the water. These gradients were not sharp boundaries, but gentle transitions, shifting slowly from brightness to dimness, from greater intensity to almost none at all. Organisms within this environment did not perceive light as shape or color. There were no outlines to follow, no images to interpret. Instead, light existed as a difference in intensity, a condition that influenced internal processes without revealing its source. Certain reactions occurred more readily in brighter regions, while others slowed as light faded. These changes were not recognized as responses to light. They were simply part of how the organism functioned within its surroundings. As bodies occupied different depths, they encountered varying levels of this intensity. A slight shift upward might bring a stronger influence, while a gentle descent would reduce it. These variations did not guide movement in a deliberate way, but they created patterns in how life persisted across space. Some forms continued where light remained more available, while others adapted to the quieter conditions below. Light also shaped the environment indirectly. It influenced the distribution of energy within the water, affecting how nutrients formed and moved. Areas exposed to higher intensity supported different chemical conditions than those in deeper, darker regions. Organisms responded to these conditions through the same processes that governed all their interactions, adjusting internally without awareness of the source. The presence of light introduced a new dimension to the world, one that extended beyond touch and chemistry, yet still remained invisible in the sense that later life would understand. It provided a gradient that stretched across the environment, offering variation without direction, influence without form. In some organisms, simple structures began to respond more directly to changes in brightness. These responses remained basic, limited to detecting differences in intensity rather than identifying any specific pattern. A shift from brighter to dimmer conditions might alter internal activity, creating a subtle link between position and process. Even so, this link did not lead to perception. It remained an interaction, not an experience. The water carried light unevenly, scattering it, absorbing it, allowing it to reach some areas more than others. These variations created a dynamic environment where intensity changed gradually across space. Organisms existed within these changes, their behavior shaped by differences they could not interpret. In this stage, light existed as a quiet influence, present long before it could be seen. It shaped where life could persist and how it functioned, yet it did so without revealing itself as an object or a source. There were no shadows to follow, no forms to distinguish, only the gentle rise and fall of intensity across the vast, silent ocean. At certain points along these soft bodies, a new sensitivity began to gather, quiet and localized, yet different from anything before it. Small clusters of cells responded more strongly to changes in brightness, altering their internal state when light increased or faded. These cells did not see, yet they marked the beginning of a distinction between light and dark that could be detected rather than merely endured. When brightness shifted across the water, these regions reacted more noticeably than the rest of the body. A gradual dimming caused a subtle change in activity, while an increase in light produced the opposite effect. The response was immediate and automatic, following the same principles that governed all earlier interactions. Still, it introduced a new kind of relationship with the environment, one based on variation in light itself rather than on indirect chemical effects. Because these light-sensitive cells were not evenly distributed, differences began to emerge across the body. One side might experience a slightly stronger signal than another, creating an imbalance that influenced how internal processes unfolded. This imbalance did not generate intention, yet it created a gentle tendency, a shift that could alter how the organism positioned itself within the water. If one region detected more light, the responses triggered there could spread through nearby tissue, subtly affecting movement or orientation. The organism did not turn toward or away in any deliberate sense, but over time, these small differences could lead to gradual adjustments in position. A body might settle in a region where the balance of light matched the conditions that allowed its processes to continue most easily. These changes remained slow and diffuse, unfolding over extended periods rather than in sudden movements. The organism did not track the source of light or form any representation of its direction. It responded only to the differences across its own surface, adjusting as those differences shifted. In some forms, these light-sensitive regions became slightly more concentrated, creating areas where detection was more pronounced. This concentration did not form an eye, nor did it provide an image. It simply enhanced the contrast between light and dark at specific points, allowing the organism to register variation more clearly in those regions. The presence of these cells introduced a new layer of interaction, one that connected the organism to a broader feature of its environment. Light, which had long shaped conditions indirectly, now influenced life through more direct detection. The organism could not interpret this influence, yet its responses began to reflect it in subtle ways. As water carried bodies through different depths or across shifting layers, the pattern of brightness changed around them. Light-sensitive cells responded continuously, creating a dynamic interaction between organism and environment that extended beyond immediate contact. This interaction remained simple, governed by automatic responses, but it marked a quiet step toward greater complexity. There was still no awareness, no image, no sense of direction as it would later be understood. Yet within these small clusters of responsive cells lay the foundation for something that would eventually transform how life experienced the world. For now, they served only to detect presence or absence, brightness or dimness, shaping existence through differences that remained unseen. In this early stage, light became more than a distant influence. It became a detectable feature, one that life could respond to directly, even if it could not yet perceive what that response meant. Across broad stretches of the ancient seabed, life settled into place and remained there. Bodies rested directly upon the surface or rose only slightly above it, held in position by structures that favored stillness over movement. The ground beneath them offered a quiet stability, a consistent plane where change arrived gently rather than all at once. From above, a slow rain of particles descended through the water. These were fragments of organic material, microscopic remains, and dissolved nutrients that gathered into drifting clusters as they sank. The descent was unhurried, guided by gravity and softened by the surrounding water, allowing these particles to spread across wide areas before coming to rest. Organisms anchored to the seafloor positioned themselves within this steady fall. Their shapes allowed them to receive what arrived, surfaces arranged to intercept the drifting material as it passed. There was no pursuit of food, no need to move toward a source. Nourishment came to them, delivered continuously by the quiet movement of the water above. For those not firmly anchored, movement remained minimal. Some bodies shifted slightly along the surface, influenced by subtle changes in flow or by the gradual accumulation of material beneath them. These adjustments were slow, almost imperceptible, allowing the organism to remain within the same general region over long periods. The environment itself supported this stillness. Conditions along the seafloor changed gradually, with temperature, chemistry, and pressure remaining within narrow ranges. This consistency allowed life to persist without the need for rapid response or adaptation. Processes could unfold at a steady pace, shaped by conditions that did not vary sharply from one moment to the next. Feeding structures reflected this stability. Some forms spread outward, increasing their contact with the passing particles, while others rose slightly to intercept material before it settled. These arrangements did not require coordination or awareness. They functioned through their shape alone, guiding particles toward regions where they could be absorbed and processed. As particles accumulated, the surface itself changed subtly, forming layers that recorded the quiet passage of time. Organisms resting upon these layers interacted with them continuously, altering the texture and composition of the seafloor in small ways. These changes, though slight, influenced how material moved and settled, shaping the environment for neighboring forms. The relationship between organism and seafloor remained close, almost inseparable. Many bodies appeared as extensions of the surface, their boundaries blending into the sediment beneath them. This connection allowed them to remain stable, resisting displacement even as water moved above. In this setting, life did not rely on speed or range. It depended on position, on being located where the flow of particles supported continued existence. Once established, an organism could remain in place, sustained by the steady delivery of nutrients and the consistent conditions that surrounded it. Across these quiet expanses, communities formed without movement drawing them together. Each organism occupied its own position, yet shared the same gentle cycle of deposition and absorption. The seafloor became a landscape of still forms, each one engaged in the same continuous exchange with the environment. Within this calm arrangement, life persisted through simplicity. Anchored or nearly so, these organisms existed in a world where stability allowed processes to continue without interruption, where nourishment arrived without effort, and where existence unfolded at the pace of the settling particles that drifted slowly down from above. Gradually, the quiet balance began to narrow. What had once been widely available no longer reached every surface with equal ease. Subtle differences in position started to influence how much material an organism could receive, and these differences, though small, began to shape how life persisted across the seafloor. As more forms occupied the same regions, the steady descent of particles no longer settled evenly. Some bodies intercepted a greater share, their structures positioned where the flow carried more material. Others, resting just beyond these paths, received less. The difference was not dramatic in any single moment, yet over long stretches of time, it altered how easily internal processes could continue. Space itself became part of this quiet shift. The surface available for resting or anchoring did not expand, while the number of organisms within it slowly increased. Bodies that spread outward could cover more area, limiting where others might settle. This expansion did not occur with intention, but through growth that followed the conditions each form encountered. Still, its effect was real, shaping the distribution of life across the environment. In this setting, small variations in structure began to matter more than before. A slightly elevated form might intercept particles earlier in their descent. A broader surface could gather more material as it passed. Even minor differences in texture could influence how nutrients settled or flowed across a body. These variations did not arise as strategies, yet they created outcomes that affected persistence. Organisms did not recognize one another as competitors. There was no awareness of sharing space or resources, yet their presence influenced each other through the environment they occupied. Where one form absorbed more, less remained for others nearby. Where one expanded, another might find fewer places to settle. These interactions remained indirect, unfolding through the same processes that had always governed life. Over time, forms that maintained more stable access to nutrients continued more easily, while others persisted under narrower conditions. This did not create sudden change, but a gradual shaping of which arrangements endured. The environment acted as a quiet filter, allowing certain structures to remain more consistently than others. The patterns of distribution began to reflect these differences. Clusters formed where conditions favored particular forms, while other areas remained sparsely occupied. These patterns did not emerge from coordination or movement, but from the accumulation of countless small interactions between structure and environment. Even within a single organism, slight adjustments could influence its position within this balance. A change in growth pattern or surface arrangement might alter how it interacted with the flow of particles, creating a new relationship with the surrounding conditions. These adjustments were not directed, yet they contributed to the ongoing shaping of life across the seafloor. In this early stage, competition remained quiet and diffuse. It did not involve direct confrontation or rapid change. Instead, it unfolded through differences in access, in how forms interacted with the environment that sustained them. The effects were subtle, yet persistent, guiding which arrangements continued and which faded. As these differences accumulated, life began to occupy its environment in more varied ways. Small advantages, once nearly indistinguishable, started to influence the course of persistence, shaping the quiet balance that had long defined this world. Subtle variations accumulated until form itself began to shift in more noticeable ways. What had once remained consistent across long stretches of time started to diverge, producing bodies that carried new arrangements, new proportions, and new possibilities within their structure. These changes did not arrive all at once, but through countless small differences that persisted and spread. Edges became less uniform. Some bodies extended into elongated shapes, introducing gentle asymmetries that altered how they interacted with the surrounding water. Others developed slight variations in thickness, creating regions that responded differently to pressure and flow. These differences, though modest, allowed movement to take on new qualities, no longer confined to simple drifting or rotation. Segments appeared in some forms, not as rigid divisions, but as repeating units that could shift in sequence. These units allowed parts of the body to change in relation to one another, creating motions that unfolded gradually along the length of the organism. The result was a more fluid kind of movement, where changes passed from one region to the next, shaping how the body adjusted its position. Structures that once served only to receive began to take on additional roles. Surfaces curved or folded in ways that influenced how material moved across them, directing flows rather than simply encountering them. These arrangements did not reflect intention, yet they altered the interaction between organism and environment, creating new patterns in how nutrients were gathered and processed. As forms diversified, their presence within the same space created more frequent points of contact. Bodies brushed against one another more often, their surfaces interacting in ways that introduced new variations in response. These interactions remained simple, governed by the same automatic processes as before, yet their increased frequency added complexity to the environment each organism experienced. Movement, though still slow and unplanned, became more varied. Some forms shifted in sequences that allowed them to change position with greater consistency, while others adjusted their orientation more readily in response to the flow of water. These movements did not aim toward specific outcomes, but they expanded the range of ways in which life could exist within its surroundings. The environment itself began to reflect this growing diversity. As different forms interacted with the seafloor and the water above it, they altered patterns of flow and deposition in new ways. These changes, in turn, influenced how other organisms experienced their surroundings, creating a feedback between form and environment that shaped both. Within this unfolding variation, no single design dominated. Instead, many possibilities coexisted, each one representing a different arrangement of structure and response. Some persisted more easily under certain conditions, while others remained confined to narrower ranges. The result was a gradual expansion of forms, each exploring a slightly different way of interacting with the world. These changes did not introduce awareness or intention, but they laid the groundwork for more complex interactions. Bodies that could move in new ways encountered different conditions, while those with altered shapes engaged with their environment through new patterns of contact and exchange. In this stage, evolution moved quietly through form itself, shaping bodies into arrangements that carried new possibilities without direction or purpose. The world remained calm, yet within that calm, variation deepened, and life began to explore a broader range of ways to exist within the same shared space. At the margins of this quiet world, differences grew sharper. What had once been gentle variation began to carry clearer consequences, as small refinements in sensing and response allowed certain forms to engage with their surroundings in slightly more defined ways. These changes did not disrupt the calm, yet they altered its balance. In some bodies, sensitivity became more focused. Regions that responded to touch, chemistry, or light began to do so with greater precision, distinguishing finer differences across smaller areas. This refinement did not create awareness, but it allowed the organism to register variation with increased clarity, shaping how its internal processes unfolded in response. A slight gradient in dissolved molecules, once experienced as a broad condition, could now influence activity more distinctly across different parts of the body. A gentle shift in brightness might create a more noticeable contrast between one side and another. These differences remained subtle, yet they introduced a new degree of responsiveness, where small changes in the environment produced more defined internal effects. With this increased precision, certain forms began to maintain more consistent relationships with their surroundings. Their responses, though still automatic, aligned more closely with the conditions that supported continued function. Over time, these alignments allowed them to persist more easily within particular environments, while others remained subject to broader fluctuations. Structure and sensing became more closely linked. Bodies that carried these refined sensitivities also displayed arrangements that supported them. Slight asymmetries, variations in surface, or distributions of responsive cells that created more distinct patterns of interaction. These features did not arise with purpose, yet they influenced how effectively an organism could respond to the gradients it encountered. As these forms continued, their presence began to shift the quiet distribution of life across the seafloor and surrounding water. Areas that once supported a wide range of forms started to favor those whose structures aligned more precisely with the available conditions. This did not exclude other organisms entirely, but it altered the balance, making persistence slightly more dependent on these emerging refinements. Interactions between organisms also took on new subtlety. Where once contact resulted in simple, localized responses, the spread of signals across more sensitive structures allowed changes to extend further through the body. This did not create coordination in the modern sense, but it deepened the connection between different regions, allowing responses to reflect a broader portion of the organism at once. The environment itself responded in kind. As certain forms became more prevalent in specific areas, they influenced how particles moved, how surfaces formed, and how chemical gradients developed. These changes, in turn, reinforced the conditions that supported their continued presence, creating a quiet feedback between organism and environment. Within this shifting balance, the earliest hints of advantage began to appear, not as competition in a direct sense, but as a gradual difference in how easily one form could persist compared to another. These differences remained small, unfolding over long periods, yet they marked a departure from the earlier uniformity. The world did not transform suddenly. It remained calm, its processes steady and continuous. Yet beneath that calm, variation deepened, and the relationships between form, sensing, and environment became more intricate. Life approached a threshold where even slight refinements could influence its course, shaping the quiet transition toward a new way of existing within the same enduring ocean. A different kind of interaction began to take shape, one that no longer relied solely on passive exchange. Certain forms moved in ways that brought them into direct contact with others more frequently, their motions carrying them across small distances with a consistency that hinted at a new role within this quiet world. These movements were still simple, shaped by internal patterns and environmental influence, yet they unfolded with greater regularity. Bodies contracted and extended in sequences that allowed them to traverse the seafloor or drift through nearby water with more persistence. Contact, once occasional, became more likely as these forms passed through spaces occupied by others. When contact occurred, the outcome began to change. Some organisms, upon encountering another body, did not simply adjust or withdraw. Their structures allowed them to envelop or press against what they touched, creating a prolonged interaction. Through this contact, material could be transferred more directly, not as drifting particles, but as substance taken from one body into another. This marked the early emergence of predation, though it remained far from the rapid pursuits of later life. There was no tracking, no recognition of a target from a distance. The encounter still depended on proximity and chance, shaped by movement rather than intention. Yet once contact was made, the interaction could extend beyond simple response, becoming a process through which one organism drew sustenance from another. Bodies that engaged in this way often displayed forms that supported it. Flexible structures allowed them to conform around what they encountered, while openings or internal spaces provided a place for material to be absorbed. These features did not arise with purpose, but they created outcomes that differed from the passive gathering of nutrients. As these interactions became more common, the overall character of the environment began to shift. Movement carried new significance, as forms that moved more persistently encountered others more frequently. This did not create a sudden increase in speed, but it introduced a greater dynamism, where contact between organisms became a more regular part of existence. Those that remained entirely passive continued to persist, yet their position within this changing balance began to narrow. Forms capable of these new interactions could access resources in ways that were not limited to what drifted through the water. This created subtle differences in how easily various organisms could maintain their internal processes. Even so, this early predation lacked the clarity and direction that would define it later. The organisms involved did not perceive one another as prey or predator. They responded to contact in ways that their structures allowed, following patterns that extended from their design rather than from any awareness of interaction. The environment responded to these changes as well. As material moved more directly between organisms, patterns of distribution shifted. Areas where such interactions occurred more frequently began to differ in composition from those where passive processes still dominated. These differences remained gradual, yet they contributed to the evolving complexity of the system. Within this stage, life remained largely without sight, guided by the same immediate signals that had always shaped its responses. Yet movement, contact, and interaction had taken on new forms, allowing relationships between organisms to deepen in ways that extended beyond simple coexistence. The quiet world persisted, but within it, a new layer of activity had begun to unfold. Bodies moved, encountered one another, and in some cases, became part of each other, marking the early presence of a dynamic that would continue to grow in the ages that followed. Something in the water itself began to change, slowly at first, then with growing influence across vast stretches of the ocean. The chemistry that had long supported quiet stability shifted in subtle ways, altering how energy moved through living systems and how bodies could sustain themselves. Oxygen, once present in smaller amounts, became more widely available within the water. It dissolved into the ocean from the atmosphere above, and was also released through biological processes occurring in sunlit regions. As its concentration increased, it changed the conditions under which life operated, allowing new forms of internal activity to take place. This rise did not transform life instantly. It unfolded over extended periods, gradually expanding the range of what was possible. Oxygen enabled more efficient metabolic processes, allowing organisms to extract greater amounts of energy from the same materials they absorbed. With this increased energy, internal systems could support more complex arrangements, sustaining structures that would have been difficult to maintain before. Bodies that once remained simple began to explore new configurations. Tissues could thicken or differentiate, forming regions that carried out slightly distinct functions. Movements, though still slow and patterned, could be sustained for longer durations, supported by the additional energy available within the organism. The environment responded as well. With more oxygen present, chemical reactions in the water and within sediments shifted, influencing how nutrients formed, moved, and became available. These changes altered the conditions across different regions, creating a broader range of environments in which life could exist. As these variations spread, the pace of change within living forms began to increase. Differences that once remained subtle started to accumulate more rapidly, as organisms with structures suited to these new conditions persisted more easily. This did not create sudden leaps, but it shortened the intervals over which variation could take hold. Interactions between organisms also reflected this shift. With more energy available, movements became slightly more sustained, and responses could involve larger portions of the body. Contact between forms occurred within a context that now supported more dynamic exchanges, adding another layer to the evolving system. The seafloor and the water above it carried these changes together. Areas that once differed only slightly in their conditions now displayed more pronounced variations, shaping where different forms could persist. Some regions supported greater activity, while others remained closer to earlier states, creating a mosaic of environments across the ocean. Within this changing landscape, life began to diversify more noticeably. Forms that had once remained similar across wide areas started to diverge, their structures reflecting the conditions they encountered. These differences, though still grounded in the same basic processes, expanded the range of possibilities within the living world. The shift did not bring awareness or intention, yet it altered the foundation upon which life operated. With more energy available, the limits that had once constrained complexity began to loosen. Structures could grow more intricate, interactions more varied, and the overall system more dynamic. In this stage, the ocean remained calm in its appearance, its motions steady and continuous. Yet beneath that surface, the conditions supporting life had changed, setting in motion a gradual acceleration that would continue to shape the forms and interactions that followed. A shallow curve appeared where once there had only been an even surface. Within certain bodies, clusters of light-sensitive cells gathered into slight depressions, forming gentle cups that altered how light reached them. This change did not yet produce an image, yet it introduced a new quality to detection, one that carried direction within it. When light entered these curved regions, it did not arrive uniformly across every cell. The shape of the depression allowed some cells to receive more light than others, depending on the angle from which it entered. A difference began to form, not just in brightness, but in where that brightness was strongest. The organism could not see, yet it could register variation across space within its own body. This simple arrangement marked a quiet shift. Light was no longer only a general condition influencing internal processes. It became a signal that carried orientation, a way for the organism to distinguish one side from another based on how illumination fell across its surface. The body did not interpret this difference, yet it responded to it, adjusting its activity in ways shaped by these uneven signals. As these light-sensitive patches deepened slightly, their ability to detect direction improved. The curvature limited the angles at which light could reach certain cells, creating a clearer contrast between areas of higher and lower intensity. This contrast did not form an image, but it refined the organism's connection to its surroundings, allowing it to respond differently depending on how light approached. In some forms, these structures became paired or arranged in patterns that increased their effectiveness. Separate regions could detect light independently, each contributing to a broader sense of variation across the body. The organism remained without awareness, yet its responses began to reflect a more structured interaction with the environment. Movement, though still guided by internal patterns and external forces, now carried a faint alignment with these signals. A body might shift in ways that altered how light fell upon these sensitive regions, creating a continuous interplay between position and detection. The organism did not choose this alignment, yet its structure allowed it to maintain certain orientations more readily than others. The emergence of these early visual systems did not replace earlier forms of sensing. Touch and chemical detection continued to shape how life responded to immediate conditions. Instead, light added another layer, one that extended beyond direct contact and introduced a broader connection to the surrounding space. As these structures spread across different forms, variation increased. Some organisms carried shallow depressions, while others developed more pronounced curves, each arrangement influencing how light was received. These differences, though subtle, created a range of capabilities that shaped how each form interacted with its environment. Within this gradual transformation, the first steps toward vision took shape. There was still no perception of objects, no recognition of forms beyond the body itself. Yet the ability to detect where light came from introduced a new dimension to existence, one that extended beyond immediate contact and internal chemistry. The ocean remained quiet, its motions steady and continuous. Yet, within its depths, these small, curved surfaces gathered light in new ways, allowing life to respond not just to its presence, but to its direction, marking the beginning of a transformation that would continue to unfold. Edges began to appear where there had once been only gradients. Light, gathered and shaped within deepening structures, formed crude contrasts that hinted at separation, a brighter region here, a dimmer outline there. Within certain bodies, these contrasts sharpened just enough to alter how movement unfolded. With this change, motion no longer remained entirely indifferent to what surrounded it. A shifting form could now maintain alignment with a moving difference in light, holding its position relative to something that changed across space. This was not recognition in the way later life would experience it, yet it allowed tracking in a simple, continuous sense, following variation as it moved. As these early visual systems improved, even slightly, the consequences spread through the environment. Bodies that could maintain this alignment encountered other forms more consistently. Contact, once dependent on chance alone, began to occur with a faint bias towards certain directions. Movement carried a subtle focus, shaped by the patterns of light that now guided it. In this shifting balance, predation gained a new efficiency. Forms capable of tracking could sustain contact longer, adjusting their movement as the other body shifted. The interaction extended beyond a single moment, becoming a sequence rather than an instant. Material transfer, once brief and uncertain, now unfolded with greater consistency, supported by this emerging ability to follow. Those without these refinements remained within the older patterns, responding only upon contact and unable to adjust before or during an encounter. Their persistence became more uncertain in regions where these new interactions occurred more frequently. The difference was not immediate, yet over time, it altered how easily different forms could continue. For the first time, movement carried a relation to something beyond the body itself. It could be shaped by external variation in a way that extended across moments, linking one instant to the next. This created the earliest forms of targeting, not as a deliberate act, but as a sustained alignment between motion and stimulus. Escape, in turn, began to emerge from the same process. Bodies that could detect changes in light across their surfaces could shift in response before direct contact occurred. A moving contrast might signal the approach of another form, allowing a slight adjustment that altered the outcome of an encounter. This adjustment did not involve awareness, yet it introduced a new possibility, movement that occurred before touch. As these capabilities spread, the rhythm of the environment changed. Interactions became more dynamic, unfolding over short sequences rather than isolated moments. Movement, contact, and response intertwined in new ways, creating patterns that carried through time rather than ending at the instant they began. The ocean itself remained calm in its broad motion, yet within it, a quiet transformation had taken place. Light, once only a distant influence, had become a guide for movement, shaping how organisms encountered one another. This shift altered the balance that had defined life for so long, introducing a new layer of interaction that extended beyond immediate contact. In this moment, the structure of existence changed. Life began to move in relation to what it could detect, allowing interactions to unfold with greater continuity. Predators became more effective, and those they encountered faced conditions that required new forms of response. The quiet world persisted, yet within it, a new dynamic had taken hold, one that would continue to shape the course of life in the ages that followed. Forms multiplied until the seafloor and the water above it could no longer be described as a single, quiet arrangement. Variation, once gradual and restrained, began to unfold with increasing speed, producing bodies that differed not only in shape, but in structure, composition, and the ways they interacted with one another. Some organisms developed outer layers that hardened, creating shells that held their shape against pressure and contact. These structures provided support, allowing bodies to maintain more defined forms as they moved or rested. The presence of harder materials also altered how these organisms interacted with their surroundings, changing the flow of water around them and the way they engaged with other forms. Limbs and appendages began to emerge in certain bodies, extending outward in ways that allowed for more controlled movement. These structures did not yet reflect the precision of later life, yet they introduced a new capacity to shift position with greater consistency. Movement could now involve coordinated extensions and contractions that carried the body across surfaces or through the water with increased stability. Internal organization grew more complex as well. Regions within the body began to specialize, supporting different functions that worked together to sustain the organism. This specialization allowed for more intricate patterns of activity, linking sensing, movement, and internal processes into arrangements that could respond more dynamically to changing conditions. As these forms diversified, the environment became more structured by their presence. Organisms occupied different layers of space, some resting along the seafloor, others moving just above it, creating a vertical dimension to the distribution of life. This layering introduced new patterns of interaction as forms encountered one another in more varied ways. The increase in complexity also intensified the relationships between organisms. Predation, once limited in scope, expanded as bodies capable of tracking and sustained movement interacted with a wider range of forms. Shells provided some protection, while limbs allowed for escape or repositioning. These developments did not eliminate interaction, but they reshaped it, adding new possibilities to each encounter. Resources became more actively contested within this expanding system. Nutrients, space, and position within the environment all influenced how easily an organism could persist. Forms that could move more effectively or protect themselves more reliably maintained their presence under a broader range of conditions, while others faced increasing limitations. This shift did not produce uniform outcomes. Instead, it created a wide array of forms, each exploring different arrangements of structure and function. Some remained simple, continuing to rely on earlier patterns, while others developed increasingly complex bodies that reflected the new possibilities available to them. The ocean, once defined by quiet continuity, now held a growing diversity of life, each form contributing to a more intricate system of interactions. Movement, contact, and response became more varied, unfolding across a landscape shaped by both physical conditions and the presence of other organisms. Within this expanding diversity, Life no longer followed a single shared pattern. It branched into multiple paths, each defined by different combinations of structure and interaction. The calm rhythm of earlier stages remained in some regions, yet alongside it, a more dynamic world had taken form, where variation itself became the defining feature of existence. Gradually, the quiet forms that once defined the seafloor began to lose their place. They did not vanish all at once, nor did the change announce itself in any sudden way. Instead, the balance that had sustained them for so long shifted beyond the range they could maintain. Bodies that remained without directional sensing or coordinated movement found themselves at a disadvantage in this new arrangement. Interactions that had once been rare or neutral now carried consequences that unfolded more quickly. Contact no longer ended in simple adjustment. It could extend, persist, and lead to outcomes that these older forms could not counter or avoid. Without the ability to detect approaching changes in their surroundings, these organisms continued to respond only after contact had already occurred. In a world where movement and interaction had become more dynamic, this delay narrowed their chances of persistence. The difference remained subtle in each moment, yet over time it altered the overall distribution of life. Some of these forms continued in regions where conditions remained closer to earlier states. In quieter areas, where movement was limited and interactions less frequent, they persisted much as they had before. Their structures, unchanged, still allowed them to function within these narrower ranges, yet beyond these pockets, their presence began to thin. Others disappeared entirely from the record, their forms no longer appearing among the impressions preserved in sediment. Their absence did not leave a clear boundary, but a gradual fading, where shapes that once appeared across wide areas became rare, then absent altogether. What had been common became difficult to find. The environment itself reflected this transition. Surfaces once covered by soft, continuous forms became more varied, occupied by organisms whose structures allowed for movement, protection, or more precise interaction. The texture of the seafloor changed as these newer forms influenced how material settled and how space was occupied. This shift did not represent a failure of the earlier forms, but a change in the conditions that supported them. Their design had been suited to a world of quiet exchange and limited interaction. As that world gave way to one shaped by movement and more frequent contact, those same designs became less effective. Even as they declined, traces of their presence remained within the patterns of the environment. The way particles settled, the subtle shaping of surfaces, and the quiet imprint of their former abundance persisted for a time, blending with the emerging complexity of the new forms. The transition unfolded across extended periods, without clear beginning or end. It was not a replacement, but a gradual shift in balance, where certain forms became less common while others expanded. The ocean carried both the remnants of the earlier world and the structures of the new within the same continuous space. In this passage, the eyeless world did not end abruptly. It receded, becoming less dominant as new interactions and capabilities shaped the course of life. What remained was a quieter presence, confined to places where the conditions of the past still lingered. As the balance continued to shift, the patterns that had once defined existence gave way to arrangements that reflected a different set of possibilities. The old world faded not through sudden loss, but through the steady change of conditions that no longer sustained it in the same way. Far from the bright layers where movement and interaction grew more intense, there are places where the older patterns never fully disappeared. In the deepest parts of the ocean, and within the hidden passages of stone, conditions remain quiet, stable, and dim enough that vision offers little advantage. Here, Life continues in ways that resemble those earlier forms, shaped by the same gentle exchanges that once defined the entire world. In the deep sea, light fades into near absence, leaving an environment where brightness carries no useful detail. Organisms living at these depths often lack functional eyes, or carry only remnants of structures that no longer serve a purpose. Their bodies rely instead on touch, chemical sensing, and subtle changes in pressure, allowing them to respond to their surroundings without ever forming an image. Movement in these regions remains slow and deliberate, shaped by currents that move with little variation. Some forms drift quietly, while others rest along the sea floor, their structures adapted to receive what the environment provides. Nutrients arrive through the steady fall of material from above or through localized chemical processes that sustain life in the absence of sunlight. Within caves, a similar quiet persists. Water-filled chambers and underground passages create isolated environments where light rarely enters. Organisms that inhabit these spaces often show a gradual reduction in visual structures, their bodies adapting to conditions where sight offers no benefit. In place of eyes, other senses become more pronounced, allowing them to navigate through touch and chemical gradients. These forms do not represent a return to the past, but a continuation of patterns that never fully vanished. Their existence reflects the persistence of conditions that still support life without vision. In these environments, the advantages of sight diminish, and the older ways of interacting with the world remain effective. The bodies of these organisms often appear simplified in ways that echo earlier stages of life. Structures that depend on visual input may be reduced or absent, while those that support direct interaction with the environment remain central. This balance allows them to persist within spaces where change occurs slowly and predictably. Even in these quiet regions, interaction continues, though it unfolds with the same subtlety that defined earlier times. Organisms encounter one another through contact or through the movement of chemical signals carried by water. These interactions do not rely on tracking or targeting, but on the immediate exchange between body and environment. The presence of these organisms offers a living connection to a much older world. They exist within conditions that resemble those of earlier eras, where stability and simplicity allowed life to continue without the need for complex perception. Their forms and behaviors carry echoes of that time, not as direct replicas, but as continuations shaped by similar constraints. Across the vast ocean and within hidden subterranean spaces, these survivors persist quietly. They do not dominate the broader environment, yet they remain as part of its diversity, occupying regions where the pace of change is slow and the conditions remain close to those that once defined the entire planet. In these places, life continues without reliance on sight, sustained by the same fundamental interactions that have always allowed it to endure, offering a quiet reminder of how existence once unfolded across the whole of Earth. There is a quiet truth carried through all of this, one that settles gently beneath every transformation that has unfolded. Life does not begin with complexity, nor does it require the features that later come to define it. It begins with the simplest exchanges, sustained by energy, shaped by chemistry, and held within the conditions of its environment. Across the long passage that led from those early forms to the more intricate structures that followed, survival never depended on sight. For vast stretches of time, life continued without any need to perceive shape or distance. It responded to what it could touch, to what it could absorb, and to the subtle signals carried through its surroundings. These interactions were enough, forming a complete system in which existence could persist and spread. As new capabilities emerged, They did not replace these foundations. Instead, they layered upon them, adding new ways of interacting without removing the old. Vision, when it appeared, expanded what was possible, yet it remained only one path among many. In environments where it offered little advantage, life continued without it, relying on the same processes that had always sustained it. This continuity reveals something steady at the core of life's history. Adaptation does not move toward a fixed goal, nor does it follow a single direction. It unfolds in response to conditions, shaping forms that fit within the possibilities available at any given time. What appears complex is not the destination, but one of many outcomes that emerge from this ongoing process. The gradual nature of these changes becomes clear when viewed across the full span of time. No single moment defines the transformation. Instead, small variations accumulate, each one adjusting how an organism interacts with its surroundings. These adjustments may seem minor, yet, over extended periods, they lead to differences that reshape entire systems. In this way, the emergence of vision can be understood not as a sudden innovation, but as part of a broader pattern. Light-sensitive cells formed, refined, and eventually allowed for more detailed interaction with the environment. At each stage, the organism remained functional, its survival supported by the same underlying processes that existed before these changes began. The persistence of life in environments without light further reflects this principle. Where conditions limit certain capabilities, other forms of interaction remain sufficient. Touch, chemical sensing, and the movement of water continue to provide the information needed for life to respond and endure. These processes are not remnants of an earlier time, but active expressions of life's ability to adapt. Even as complexity increases, the foundation remains unchanged. Energy flows, chemical reactions occur, and environments shape what is possible. These elements form the constant background against which all variations arise. No matter how intricate a form becomes, it is still rooted in these basic interactions. Through this lens, the story of life appears less as a progression toward greater sophistication and more as a continuous unfolding of possibilities. Each environment invites certain adaptations, and life responds by shaping itself within those boundaries. Some paths lead to structures that perceive and interpret, while others remain simple, yet no less effective within their own conditions. The history carried within these changes reflects a steady rhythm rather than a sudden shift. Life builds gradually, layer by layer, guided not by intention, but by the quiet influence of its surroundings, continuing to adapt in ways that remain deeply connected to its earliest beginnings. Before any image was ever formed, before any outline was traced against the brightness of the world, there was a vast span of time in which life unfolded without ever witnessing itself. Bodies existed, interacted, and persisted without reflection, without the ability to observe their own form or the forms around them. Existence moved forward in a quiet continuity, shaped entirely by forces that did not require sight to function. In that distant age, the surface of a body carried no awareness of how it appeared, only how it responded. Contact, pressure, and the subtle presence of chemicals guided every interaction. Light, when it touched these forms, passed across them without meaning beyond its effect on internal processes. There was no image to interpret, no boundary defined by vision, only the immediate exchange between organism and environment. This difference is difficult to fully hold in mind. Every attempt to imagine that world is shaped by senses that did not yet exist. Even the simplest description carries traces of perception that those early forms could never have experienced. The shapes we assign, the movements we describe, and the relationships we outline are filtered through an understanding that developed much later. Because of this, much of that time remains beyond direct comprehension. It is not hidden, yet it resists being fully known. The evidence that remains offers fragments, impressions preserved within layers of stone, subtle patterns that hint at how life once existed. These traces provide structure to the story, yet they leave space where details cannot be filled. Within that space, the past feels unfamiliar, not because it is distant, but because it operated under conditions that no longer define the present. The absence of vision, the reliance on simple interactions, and the steady rhythm of those early environments create a world that does not align easily with modern experience. It is not a variation of what exists now, but something fundamentally different in how it unfolded. And yet, it is part of the same continuous history. The processes that sustained those early forms still persist, woven into the complexity that followed. Every organism that exists today carries within it the legacy of those simpler beginnings, shaped by the same fundamental exchanges that allowed life to endure in that earlier time. There is a quiet continuity that connects these distant moments to the present. The forms have changed, the interactions have grown more intricate, and new capabilities have emerged, yet the foundation remains steady. Life continues to adapt, responding to its environment in ways that reflect both its past and its present. As this journey settles into stillness, the image of that unseen world lingers gently, not as something fully revealed, but as something partially understood. It exists at the edge of knowledge, where evidence meets imagination, where what is known blends with what can only be suggested. If you find yourself drawn to these quiet histories, to the hidden layers of science that reveal how different existence once was, there is always more to explore. You can follow along, subscribe, and continue this journey into the calm and curious depths of the world we rarely notice, where stories like this continue to unfold in silence.